Hi, everybody, and welcome to our biology course. This is Bio 104, Introduction to Human Ecology. We're going to start very basic by looking at some of the terminology that is related to science, biology, and more specifically, human ecology. So think about this as an overview of the direction our course is going to move toward. So we're going to start simple by looking at what is the word science actually means. So the word science comes from the Latin word to know. It is very important for us to understand that the learning process when it comes to science is very important on our capacity of how we observe and assess the world surrounding us. We understand our world by asking questions, by making observations of our surrounding, and that could be both externally and internally, finding ways to test and answer the questions that we have asked, and then continue to share that information and find new discoveries. Now, when we're talking about the science, we use the following terminology, words such as facts, ideas, hypotheses, and theories. And we're going to spend a few minutes kind of discovering what is the difference between these terminologies. So, oh, sorry. So one of the first things we want to talk about is that when we talk about science, we actually think about the understanding of the science and what science is for us as a process. It is not something that happens at an instant, um, and it's definitely not something that is solid and immovable in a sense. We start the science by making observations. And there is actually a branch of science that is known as observational or descriptive science. Now, this is not a typical science that we do. We actually kind of looking at collecting informations and not necessarily answering any questions. So it's kind of you making observations about your surrounding. Um, it is the basis of what science is going to be, but it's just observational. So you can observe how a plant grows. You can observe how an animal behaves. We can collect on how the birds fly, the direction, the distance. We can look at information about, again, our surrounding, our internal structures. But again, it is based on observation. Another way of approaching science, which is better known, is what we call hypothesis-driven science. And again, it's important for us to distinguish what is the word and the terminology that we use in our day-to-day life versus what it means in a scientific sense. So hypothesis-driven is looking at something based on a question that can be tested. And we're going to kind of discuss that in just a minute. But for hypothesis-driven science, we are highly dependent on a process known as the scientific method. And the scientific method, as you can see, is very well structured. It is, sorry, I'm going to move my image on the side. It has very specific steps that needs to be followed. And if it is not followed, we don't really necessarily trust what we have collected at the end. Now, the hypothesis-driven science, or what we call scientific method, starts with what we call an observation, which is very similar to the descriptive science. You make observations, again, about what you're interested in. And based on those observations, you create a question. For instance, let's say you are observing that the plants that are located on the left side of your house and are placed in the shaded area have the tendency to not grow as much as the plant that receive more sunlight. That's an observation. And you will follow this by a question. A question is like, why do plants in shade grow less effectively compared to the plants that are in the sun? So again, you're kind of using that observation to drive the question that you're coming up with. Now, based on that question, you can draw what we consider an educated guess, which is also known as a hypothesis. My hypothesis could be that plants in the sun grow faster because sun is an essential component for plant growth. And it is important for us to note that a hypothesis must be in a form that can be first testable. So I can take it and write an experiment to check to see if that hypothesis can be either supported or rejected. And it's also the fact that the hypothesis has to have the capacity to be falsifiable, which means, again, you have that component of, yes, my hypothesis was correct. No, my hypothesis was wrong. You cannot write it in an kind of an estate format, a statement format where there is no falsibility to that statement. Right. So again, scientific method continues by us doing what we call experimentation. Again, testing to see if our hypothesis is supported or rejected. So that concept of support versus rejection is very important. You can more than welcome to kind of look at the flowchart that is presented here. And then after that, after we have done the experiment and we have found supporting data for our original hypothesis, we can actually continue that by making a communication to the colleagues within our field. Let's say if you're studying ecology, you can present that information to scientists that also study ecology. But please do note that it is important that anytime a scientific work is being communicated, it has to have been tested multiple times, so that repetition is a necessary component for the process of the scientific method. Now, there is a difference, and again, this is what I was talking about, us using terminology on a day-to-day basis versus what we can consider as a scientific terminology. We use the word theory very kind of in layman's terms. Oh, my theory is that. Now, in science, that the word theory has a lot of weight to it. What we consider theory is a well-tested and widely accepted explanation for a reality around us. It is extensively validated by a large amount of research. For instance, that every living organism is made up of cells is a theory. It's called cell theory. So again, this is not, when we're saying using a word theory, it is not a speculation as we use in our regular day-to-day terms. So a paradigm shift, and it's basically a new dominant view replacing the old view. For instance, before we think about kind of medieval times, that the earth was the center of the universe and sun and the stars were turning around the sun, but eventually was discovered that the earth is actually just a planet circling around the sun. So that shift, that dynamic shift, is very important. Another word is thinking about the earth being flat versus round, correct? So that shift that we're talking about from the old view to the new view, because all of that scientific concept has come to be tested and accepted as an explanation. Now, again, because we're going to talk about human ecology, we also need to understand that a lot of our concepts are going to be talking about living organisms. So we also have to have an understanding of biology. So the word biology implies a study of living organisms. So bio means life. Ology implies a study of. So when we say biology, we're literally studying of life. Now, for something to be considered living, we need to have certain characteristics. And these characteristics are they contain order, they are able to carry metabolism, there is a concept of action and reaction, so they respond to their environment. They have the ability to grow and develop. They have the ability to reproduce an offspring. And then they follow the evolution theory, which means they are changing over time. So kind of looking at this in a little bit more detail, first starting by looking at the order. They have to have that order to be considered a living organism. If you look at the top picture right here, this is what we consider an order. At the most basic level, every living organism is made up of atoms and molecules. And those atom molecules continue to form what we call our cells. Cells form what we call tissue. Tissue forms our organs, and then organs form your organisms. And again, this is going to kind of continue and advance in the sense of ecology, where we kind of get our ecosystems. But at this level, for an individual organism, you are going through the order, this hierarchical system, where you start with very small components that kind of combine together to form something more complex. So again, for us as a human, we will have atoms and molecules forming our cells, cells forming our tissue, tissue forming our organs, organs forming our organ systems, and organ systems all together bring us to become a human being. Metabolism. So think about metabolism as any type of chemical reaction that keeps us alive. It's our ability to break down our food, to get nutrition from it, and also kind of combining those little molecules that we have to form something more complex. If you have heard of the words such as catabolism and anabolism, both of those fall under the terminology metabolism. Responding to an environment. So kind of think about it as you get hot, you sweat. A sunflower turning its head toward the sun is a response to the sunlight. Your eyes closing, if something is being thrown at you, that reflex is a response to an environment. And again, you can find these examples in any living organism. They are very diverse. They can be very simple or very complex. But again, there is an action and reaction component. Growth and development, we can think about humans, where we start from a single cell and eventually becomes an embryo and a fetus and a grown adult. We can think about plants being a single seed that eventually grow to be a tree or a flower. Regardless of what we talk about in terms of growth, any sense of growth in our plants or animals or living creatures lying in between these two would be considered growth and development. Reproduction. Reproduction can be very basic, like looking at our bacteria, where basically one bacteria grows to become two cells. That can be representative of reproduction, or it could be as complex as what we see in humans, where you have sexual reproduction, and you have to have two different opposing sexes coming together to form the fertilized egg, an eventual human being. And as I mentioned before, the word evolution implies that your organism, whether it be bacteria, a plant cell, or an animal cell, undergoing changes over time. Now, when we're talking about ecology, because that is our focus here, ecology actually studies the relationship between different groups of living organisms and how those living organisms also interact with their environments. So putting those two concepts. So now it is important to note that when we're talking about our environment, it could include the living organism interacting with other living organisms or interacting with non-living. So anything within that environment is acceptable. And we'll kind of expand on that throughout all of our lectures this semester. So the questions we usually ask in ecology is how the environment affects life, Get it be an individual living organism such as bacteria versus a multicellular complex organisms like humans. And also how life can have an effect on our environment. As we can see, again, as humans, we have a significant effect on our environment, causing a lot of pollution and destruction within our environment. Now, when we study ecology, we kind of again have that hierarchical system. So an individual organism can be part of a larger group of the same organism that form a population. When we talk about a community, the word community implies that we're thinking about the animal living in a very set environment with the living organisms. An ecosystem would be including all of the living and non-living organisms. And then biosphere, for instance, our Earth would be a combination of all of the ecosystems that are present put together. So again, kind of understand the hierarchical nature. When we're talking about ecology, we're going from organisms to population to a community to an ecosystem to a biosphere. Now, when we're talking about our ecosystems, again, ecosystems implies that we have anything that is living, so living, interacting with other living organisms, as well as non-living components, such as, let's say, the stone, the water, the soil, etc. So the terminology we use for them is if we're talking about living components of an ecosystem, we call those biotic. Again, remember, bio means living. And then abiotic means the physical components. Anytime you hear this letter A coming in front of anything, that makes it negative or lack of something. So abiotic means basically anything that is non-living. That could be the chemicals resources, the physical conditions. Again, think about the habitats. If you have dirt and a stone and water and air and the humidity, all of those components would be the abiotic component. So here is an examples of lichens such as fungi and algae, and then you have the mites and other microorganisms or microscopic or invertebrates that are kind of living together in an organism. So you don't have to have this giant living organism, let's say like a human. Even the small bacteria can consider as part of the living organism. Now, we also talk about environmental science that has become a very popular concept, even though many people, depending on our society, may or may not accept it. Environmental science is basically understanding or studying how our environment and us are interacting with each other. How do we impact each other? It is goal is to kind of follow and figure out how that interaction is beneficial or harmful, and try to resolve those problems. There is an example, you guys are welcome to read through it, that we are looking at lower number of the fish, and our goal is to, again, understand why that population is declining, and then figuring out how we can restore the population and improve the environment for all the living organisms, including us. A lot of this science is based on the concept of sustainability, by the way. Now, scientists always try to remain objective. So, right, we don't necessarily want to be kind of biased toward, oh, I have this opinion and this personal opinion is going to have an effect on my views in terms of how I am going to address the issue. Personal beliefs, personal biases, and preconceptions have no place in science, including our environmental science. So we always have to remember that science is evidence-based. We do not, sorry about that. We do not kind of think about science as I bring my own personal opinion to it. It has to be stayed out of it. Now, there is this concept of environmentalism, which is, again, started relatively recently. It is when we have what we call a social movement that is dedicated to providing support for our environment and protecting all of our natural resources. And the goal, again, is sustainability foremost, to prevent extinctions of organisms and being able to make sure that we can live harmoniously next to each other. Again, that doesn't mean that we're not going to kill animals. It's just, let's say, can we kill animals or use the soil for agriculture, but in the methods that are more sustainable and allow future generation to also have access to those resources. Sorry. So why do we study environmental science? Again, I kind of talked about this already. We're kind of looking at our resources and what's available to us, and we want to understand how we can better our environment. That could be bettering in terms of, again, improving health or wealth, depending on your view, and how that environmental science can also kind of backfire for some people to take advantage of the resources that are available and misuse those to cause damage to the natural systems. Now, the question is, how many people can Earth support in reality? Why does the answer keep increasing and who's paying for it? So here's the answer. So as of November 2022, the human populations are about 8 billion. That's actually a little more, of course. You actually can check to see the Earth population. Do a Google search if you haven't done that, and that gives you an idea of what that population is at that moment, at that instant. But one of the biggest reasons where that number keeps changing is because we are finding more and more methods to improve the capacity of our capacity by improving our agricultural technology, making sure that the water and soil are being used in the most effective and most sustainable way. We are definitely improving in terms of genetic manipulations, where a lot of these foods are now less susceptible to parasites and aphids and things that can basically wipe up a huge amount of agriculture. And as we talk about this later on in the semester, we actually have we produce, as humans, we produce more food than we can consume. The problem is transporting those foods, those resources to where people actually need it. I like this quote. I wanted to share this with you. If all insects on the earth disappeared with 50 years, all life on earth would end. If all human begins disappearing from the earth within 50 years, all form of life would flourish. So that should kind of give you an idea of how humans, as we are proud of ourselves as an organism, as the top of the food chain, we're actually causing so much harm to our environment. So I will stop this PowerPoint and I will continue with the next